Is there a place in time where logic breaks down and wonderment begins? Could that be somewhere at some time along an infinite line between the reasonable and the highly unlikely? Join us on a journey into the improbable.
Today's story, episode 255, Signal, read by Mitchell 2. Opening and closing theme by Matthew Erdman. Somewhere and sometime, the truth might not be easy to find. It was in an old article on unsolved disappearances linked to UFOs where I first came across Todd Olson's story. Because of the remote location and the fact that the local community didn't make much of the incident, his story had a very short half-life. Todd's disappearance had been explained away in the mainstream media as a disgruntled teen who had run away and met with misfortune. However, in the backwaters of the UFO community, where it has been retold and retold for the last 3 decades, his brilliance as an inventor and his rumored contact with aliens kept it alive. As a result, the story has gone through the transmission chain so many times, it's hard to know what's real anymore. Claims such as he discovered the secret to faster-than-light travel, built his own spaceship and left Earth, or was so brilliant that aliens took note and whisked him away before he could prove their existence, only serve to muddy the waters. In fact, the story was so barnacled with imaginative speculation that I almost consigned it to the pile of things that, while mildly interesting, I would never follow up on. That was until I stumbled upon the message he had left, tacked to the door of the workshed on his uncle's property. Dated June 21st, 2056, it reads as follows. I have been invited to go on a great adventure to explore the universe. Given time dilation and the many uncharted mysteries which await, it is difficult to know when I will be back. But unlike Houdini, I will return, in some form, to tell the world of the marvels I have seen. It was the part about his return at some future point and the Houdini reference which piqued my interest. According to one account, his cousin claimed to have heard from Todd several times over the last 30 years, although she had refused to say anything more or reveal the content of his messages. The loose ends soon intrigued me so much that this past summer I took my holidays and went to Salmon Cove, Alaska, where Todd had lived, to gather first-hand interviews. There are only 2 practical ways to get to Salmon Cove, by boat or by plane. Certainly you can drive, but the route is so convoluted and there aren't adequate charging stations, so just getting there would have taken my entire holiday. Having limited time, I opted to fly. From Juneau, it was an hour and a half down the coast on a hydrogen-powered seaplane. If you ever choose to go and have more time than money, a boat is a more affordable option. Despite the cost to get there, tourism is the major industry, at least today. Historically, the town suffered from the endless boom and bust cycles of resource extraction until the area was declared a nature reserve for the species forced north by climate change. Now, tourism supports a somewhat smaller community. But by the time I left to go there, the only person who had responded to my requests for a meeting was Asher Williams, one of Todd's few close friends. He met me the day after I arrived at the Golden Poplar Coffee House on Main Street, a tin-clad structure with an early 20th century Western facade. Despite it being a cloudy day, Asher insisted on sitting outside at an old picnic table placed in the lane beside the building. A few pots of anemic-looking annuals, abandoned between the table and the gravel lane, served to define a kind of patio, albeit one infested with weeds. Asher was a bit heavier in the flesh than the photo of him on the webpage for the 100 Mile Distillery where he worked and through which I had managed to contact him. His bio said he was 55 years old, but to me, he looked older. Admittedly, I'm used to people starting anti-senescence treatments in their late 40s. He appeared to wait until no one was in earshot before he was willing to talk. "Yeah, I knew Todd. I grew up with him," he said, staring into his coffee as if it was a crystal ball. "My mother ran a day home. Both of Todd's parents worked. His mom at the motel and his dad at the cruise ship dock in the summer. He drove a snowplow in the winter. Anyway, my mom looked after Todd, so I've known him for as long as I can remember. I was his best and only friend. You see, Todd wasn't well liked. He was a bit of an oddball. He spent most of his time in his uncle's shed building stuff. Todd was, different, you see. He was so smart. It was scary, and he was good at everything he did, even sports. So while the rest of us struggled in school, Todd just breezed through without even trying. I guess a lot of us were jealous of him. But he was an introvert, and people tended to mistake his shyness for arrogance. He'd invite me over to his uncle's shed. I never really understood what he was doing. I'd get tools for him or solder components together. Once, he built this machine which turned a fan blade. No one could figure it out. There was no obvious power source. The thing kept the blade spinning for weeks on end. He even took it into school and showed our science teacher, Ms. Palmer. She thought he had somehow hidden a battery in it, but he insisted it ran on something he called zero-point energy. None of us knew what that was, and Ms. Palmer said it wasn't possible and wanted to take it apart to look for the battery. I asked Asher what had happened to the machine. "He took it home and destroyed it soon after that," he replied. "Todd said that the world was obviously not ready for his vacuum energy converter, because it would make energy as cheap as air, and that was something the powers that be would come after him to prevent. He became convinced Ms. Palmer had been paid off to pass his ideas along, so he stopped showing people what he was up to. Everyone except me." "And what do you think? Was it really making energy out of nothing?" "Well, there wasn't a battery as far as I knew. I watched him make it. I don't know, maybe he altered it when I wasn't there. But I believe he was right. If the thing was real, there'd be dangerous people out there to stop him from sharing it with the world." "Do you think this invention is somehow connected to his eventual disappearance?" "No, I don't think so. He built the machine a few years before he disappeared. But I'm sure he was telling the truth. It worked. I saw it with my own eyes. Todd didn't care what people thought, so he had no reason to deceive anyone. So when he said he left on some big adventure, then that is what he did. He had no reason to lie." One of the articles I read said that Todd claimed to be communicating with extraterrestrials. Do you think he was? Asher blew on his coffee to cool it, tentatively took a sip, then looked around. Seeing no one close enough to hear, he continued in a low voice. "I helped him build a big dish-shaped antenna on his uncle's property. I think it's still there. He had it wired up to some kind of DIY ham radio setup he hacked together. He didn't want anyone to know about it because he didn't have a ham radio license. He mostly just listened for signals. I spent a couple of nights with him in what he called the lab, scanning the shortwave bands. We got weird noises and other stuff. It didn't sound like anything to me, but Todd said there were messages buried in it." "What do you think? Were there really messages in the static?" "I'm not sure, maybe. Once he played a recording for me. It was pretty weird. Lots of wavy tones mixed with static. He was really excited, said it was a response to a message he had sent. But he didn't tell me what it meant. The sheriff came out to his uncle's place a couple of days later, and that was the end of the radio. Someone must have complained. No one knows I was involved, and I want to keep it that way." "No problem," I assured. "I'll keep that fact out of anything I write. Is there anything else you feel I should know?" "Yeah, just before he left, he said he was working on something he claimed would disrupt the entire transportation system. He might have said the plans had been sent to him from space, so he could meet the people or whatever he had been communicating with. But I can't quite remember the details. We had been drinking, and he only mentioned it once. Soon after that, he disappeared." Asher stopped talking and watched an older couple walk by on the street. Once they had turned the corner, he leaned in and almost whispered, "Despite what some people around here think, Todd was the most honest and brave person I knew. Although I might be the only person to admit it, he was a hero to many of us his age. I mean, he did what he said he was going to do and escape this place, and that's not easy." I tried to get Asher to loop back to the transportation thing, but he had to leave. "You should really talk to Jack Parker," he said. "I'll set it up for you." The next day, I met Jack Parker, the local sheriff at the time of Todd's disappearance. He was retired now and lived at an assisted living place called Ocean View Manor, just off Main Street. The building didn't have an ocean view and wasn't anything close to what I would call a manor. Instead, it was a single-story structure, reminiscent of a motel covered in beige vinyl siding with a view of a vacant lot where the lumberyard once stood. It housed about 30 apartments. Jack was in number 17. Now 80, he had been retired for a decade and a half. Despite his mobility issues, his mind proved to be surprisingly sharp and his memory excellent. I spent 2 hours with him talking about the town, its people, his investigations into Todd's disappearance, and other unsolved local mysteries. "I knew the family as well as I know anyone else around here," he stated flatly, as if he was answering a question in court. "I heard all the rumors like the rest of the town, but I didn't pay much attention to them. The Olsons kept to themselves, and people who do that tend to attract speculation and gossip. They didn't have a lot of money, and sold their acreage so they could afford to get Todd, changed." I assumed he was hinting that Todd had undergone some form of intrauterine fetal gene therapy before he was born. It was a common but expensive procedure used to reduce the risks of inherited conditions such as heart disease or diabetes. However, wealthy parents paid for upgrades, and that was still controversial in some parts of the world. "I'm not sure what you mean," I said, hoping he'd confirm my assumption. Changed," Jack repeated. "Are you saying he was upgraded?" I could tell from his expression that he didn't approve of designer babies and felt uncomfortable talking about the subject. It was the first time I had come across this information and knew it was important, but the old cop wouldn't say anything more about it. "You should probably be talking to Charlotte Olson about that. I shouldn't have mentioned it," he backtracked. "She's Todd's cousin and the last of the family still alive. I'll give you her contact information. Tell her you talked to me, otherwise she might refuse to see you." Anyway, Todd's parents moved into town and lived with the brother. He had an old double-wide behind the house. The place is still there, over on 4th Avenue. Charlotte inherited it, and she lives on the property. The only time I was ever out to their place was when the airport complained about a radio signal interfering with their navigation system or something. The FCC had to come all the way up here to figure out what was going on. They triangulated the signal to the Olson place. So I went out there with them to see what was causing it. We found a clearing at the back of the property where Todd had built this big dish out of recycled wire screen and old metal tubing. It was maybe 6 yards across. As far as I know, it's still out there on the property. He was only 13 at the time, and the FCC people were blown away by how powerful the transmitter was that the kid had cobbled together. If he had been older, they would have arrested him. But instead, they just took his transmitter and warned him not to build another one. Apparently, they also let him keep a receiver, because not long after they left, Todd claimed he was getting messages from space. To me, that was the start of the craziness. Jack went on to talk about the official police search for Todd, which had lasted several weeks and turned up nothing conclusive. "You probably want to know what I think happened to Todd," he finally said. "He either got lost out in the bush and died of exposure, which is the most likely scenario, or he ran away and doesn't want to be found. I know his family believed the latter, but the truth is, if he had crossed the border into Canada, someone would have eventually found him." Either way, he didn't leave in a spaceship like some of your UFO pals think. Jack leaned back in his recliner chair and indicated the meeting was over. Charlotte Olson didn't return my calls, so it took me 2 days to track her down. I finally bumped into her at the Golden Poplar Coffee House. She was a weathered-looking woman in her mid-50s wearing a green plaid bush jacket. Her long, brown, gray-streaked hair spilled out under a baseball cap, which sported a Northwest Bus Tours logo. Charlotte ran a seasonal business, taking tourists out to the new nature reserve. At first, she didn't want to talk, but I managed to convince her I wasn't there to write some sensational story about her cousin's disappearance. We met later that afternoon at her place on the edge of town. An older A-frame house, which had seen better days, sat at the front of the property. It was where Charlotte lived. The front yard was mostly gravel, where she parked the refurbed Chinese-built minibus she used for her tours. The other buildings were in poor shape, partially hidden by years of overgrowth. Charlotte met me on the steps of the A-frame and steered me over to an old picnic table. I handed her a coffee I had bought for her in town, and we both sat down. "I hope you're not here to stir things up again," she said. "You should really let sleeping dogs lie." "No, that's not my intention," I assured her. "I'm a researcher, not a writer. I just want to ferret out the truth and, if possible, add a bit of closure to the mystery. I'm not here to prove some outlandish theory. I take it that you don't believe he left the planet with aliens." Charlotte laughed, then pulled the lid off her coffee and tentatively took a sip, then stared out at the mountains. "I don't know what happened to him," she finally admitted. "Sheriff Parker is convinced Todd got lost out there and died." She nodded at the mountains. "But that just wasn't Todd. He didn't like the outdoors, so I doubt he wandered off into the wilderness. I'm a bit older than my cousin, so we weren't particularly close despite living next to each other. His family lived in the old double-wide behind the house. Dad let them live there because no one else was going to help them." "Why's that?" I asked. "Because they sold everything so they could have Todd upgraded. You see, they didn't want him to end up living here. They wanted him to do more than just survive in Salmon Cove. People saw that as a slight against the town and the people who live here." "Do you think it was?" Charlotte shrugged and looked away at the mountains again. "I don't know, maybe. However, I'd probably get out too if I had the money. Unfortunately, it's not like there's a lineup to buy this place or a barely profitable tour bus operation." "Upgrades are extremely expensive," I pointed out. "How'd they pay for it?" "Todd's parents weren't rich, obviously. The place they sold only covered a small part of the costs. Charlotte hesitated. "I guess there's no one around anymore who would care. Look, they enrolled Todd in the deferred service program. The military paid, but Todd had to serve 6 years. If he didn't, his parents would have to pay back all the money. The family kept it quiet. When my cousin was about 16, I overheard my uncle and Todd arguing about it. That was at the start of the Taiwan conflict. At the time, no one knew if we were going to get involved. Despite the war, Todd's father said serving was his ticket out of Salmon Cove. He'd do 6 years as a drone pilot or something, and then he could do whatever he wanted. But Todd, being Todd, pointed out there was no guarantee that he wouldn't find himself pounding the ground somewhere around the South China Sea, so he didn't want anything to do with the military or the war. If you knew him, that made sense. He never liked authority, and he didn't like being told what to do. I think the upgrades did more than make Todd smart and strong. They made him unique. So unique that he didn't fit in anywhere. He was always out in my dad's shed inventing stuff. He built that radio dish, which brought the authorities out here. The whole family was really ticked at him about it, but Todd didn't care. He secretly built another transmitter after they left. He once boasted to me that he had improved it so no one could detect it. It's still in the shed. And it works? I asked. Yes, it does. I know it might sound silly, but I still go out there now and then to call him and listen for a response. He's never answered. She stood up. Come on, I'll show you. I followed Charlotte down a winding path past the old double-wide to a ramshackle shed with a padlocked door. Charlotte dialed in a combination, pulled the lock open, and beckoned me in. The shed was in a bad state of neglect. The roof was leaking at the far end, so water had dripped onto the workbench at the back, where a scattering of tools lay rusting. The place smelt of discarded motor oil and moldy earth. In one corner, near the door, there was a room in relatively good shape. As we walked over to it, I realized it wasn't a room at all. It was a complete, freestanding structure. That's where Todd used to make stuff. He called it his lab, Charlotte explained, flicking a switch mounted to its outside wall. The walls inside were lined with shelves containing bits and pieces of electronics, wire, electric motors, and other things I didn't recognize. Todd used to go around collecting e-garbage he'd cannibalize for parts. That's the radio over there, Charlotte explained and pointed to a makeshift desk made out of sawhorses with a piece of plywood laid across them. On it was a kludge of electronics connected to several old flat screens and speakers. Charlotte walked over and flicked a switch. The screens turned on and cooling fans sprung to life. She checked the displays, then adjusted a volume knob. We can't change the position of the radio dish anymore. It's parked where he left it. When he first disappeared, we'd come out here every day to try and contact him. She invited me to sit, and we listened to the radio as it crackled with static. There are claims that you've heard from him several times, I said, after a while. Charlotte nodded. Yeah, that's what some folks around here think, and I've never bothered correcting them. I guess I wanted people to believe he was alive, at least while Todd's parents were still around. It gave them hope. The truth is, we only picked up static and the odd shortwave radio station from Japan. When I started getting emails and calls about Todd, I didn't deny we'd been trying to contact him. I let people make of that what they wanted to, but I never said we had been successful. I figured leaving it open-ended would keep people looking for him. Also, it got me more tours. I'd show them the radio dish and take them to a place on the mountain, the old town garbage dump, where there's a circular-shaped clearing. I'd tell them it was where he was last seen and hint that it could have been a landing site. She smiled slyly. But interest dried up pretty quickly. I had to ask the obvious question. Do you think Todd just went AWOL to avoid his military service? That's what his parents thought. It's why they never gave up on him. They figured he'd crossed the border into Canada and created a new identity, but was too afraid to connect in case they could track him down. That idea made them happy. After all, if true, he had managed to get out of here, which is what they had always wanted for him. It's the reason we kept the radio working, so he could signal us once he felt sure there was no way to find him. Did he ever mention some type of transportation device he was working on? I asked. Maybe in the last few weeks before he disappeared? He never mentioned anything like that, but he was always working on something, she said, then shut down the radio. I found myself disappointed, because if I had been in Todd's shoes, I would have faked my death or simply disappeared as well. Unfortunately, there was no mystery here, and I felt like I had wasted my time. However, as Charlotte led me out of the building, I noticed a series of numbers carved into one of the exposed 2x4s beside the door. What are those? I asked. I think that's where Todd was pointing the dish. Somewhere near the constellation Sagittarius, Charlotte suggested. I looked closely at the numbers. I don't think they're astronomical coordinates. They look more like a GPS location and what looks like a radio frequency. How long have these been here? Todd showed them to me a couple of weeks before he disappeared, Charlotte said. I turned on my mobile's flashlight to get a better look. There's also a date, Look here." I pointed to the side of the 2x4. "Oh, I hadn't noticed that before," she admitted. The date was June 21st, the summer solstice next year. It was an enticing new clue which rekindled my hope that there was still something to be solved, but not in Salmon Cove. I thanked Charlotte for her help and told her that if I found any new information about her cousin, I'd let her know. Then I left and flew back to Juneau on the next plane. I let the story sit on the side of my desk until June 21st came around again. I had offered to take Charlotte with me, but she declined because June was one of her busiest months and she couldn't afford to lose the income. That is how I ended up alone at a place called Red Rock Coulee, an isolated park in Canada near the border with Montana. The site was an arid, dry grass prairie located in rolling uplands with spectacular views of the surrounding plains. Its name came from the spherical, car-sized red concretions which littered the landscape, lending the place an otherworldly feel. I couldn't help but suspect that was in part why Todd had chosen this location. I arrived there just before 12 p.m. after driving through the night from the closest major airport. Todd hadn't carved a time into the old 2x4 of his uncle's shed. Charlotte and I had tried, but failed to find one. The solstice was at 11:36 a.m., which I assumed might be the most logical time, but just in case, I wanted to be at the location for the whole 24 hours. The GPS led me to a circular, flat-topped mound a few hundred yards from the parking area. I climbed to its top, then unpacked the portable shortwave radio I had bought, turned it on, and tuned it to the right frequency. The location made sense, in that it was miles from the closest power line. There wasn't even net service to interfere with a signal. I sat back and watched the moon and stars slowly crawl across the sky until morning melted them away. Then I walked around in circles, scanning the horizon until 11:36 a.m. came and went. But all I heard from the small radio speaker was static. I waited all day, and as the twilight faded, I was about to pack it in, finally convinced it had been a wildly optimistic long shot, when, on a hunch, I jogged the tuner back and forth until I hit a signal. At first, it just sounded like the usual weird random sounds you get on some shortwave bands, until I recognized the staccato of Morse code. Excitedly, I pulled out my mobile, held it up to the speaker, and recorded the sequence. It repeated several more times before stopping. I stood up and scanned the horizon, looking to see if I was alone, but there wasn't even a bird in sight. Excited, I quickly packed up and headed to my car. An hour later, after my mobile chirped, indicating it had a network connection, I pulled off the highway. It wasn't too hard to find an online Morse code translator. I loaded the file and waited. It took a few minutes before the transcript finally opened on my screen. The message was short. "The world is not ready, TOS," and that was it. The final 3 letters. Was the T an intentional miscoding of S to disguise the universal call for help, SOS, or just a mistake? Or was the final S a slip of the fingers and the closing should have just been TO for Todd Olson? I contacted the local authorities, but they said without any real evidence, there was nothing they could do about a 30-year-old disappearance in a different country. I also let Charlotte know what I had heard. She said it gave her renewed hope. Did the message come from space? Maybe. Or, more likely, had Todd, or someone he knew, broadcast it from Montana or somewhere nearby in Canada. Both would have been possible given the location. There was nothing else I could do to find out where that signal came from. So, a few weeks later, I reluctantly put Todd Olson's story in my unresolved file and moved on to a new case. Makeshift Stories is a proud member of the Alberta Podcast Network, locally grown, community supported. To get other great APN podcasts, head over to albertapodcastnetwork.com, where you'll find Crow Reads. Host Rayanne Haynes delves into the nitty-gritty details of being an intersectional woman working in writing/publishing in Canada. This episode of Makeshift Stories is brought to you by Taproot Spotlight, a service that helps businesses and organizations pay attention to the people they serve. Taproot tells you the news about the people and companies that are important to you. Use that information internally to keep everyone on the same page, or share it with the world in your newsletter, on your website, and on your social media channels. Paying attention pays dividends. Find out more at taprootpublishing.ca/spotlight. That's taprootpublishing.ca/spotlight. This episode of Makeshift Stories is also brought to you by the Alberta Podcast Network. The Alberta Podcast Network builds audiences for Alberta-made podcasts and connects those listeners to Alberta-based businesses, organizations, and community partners. The smart, creative, engaging podcasters in our network provide an excellent opportunity to reach listeners who are interested in local topics, as well as those around the world who enjoy our shows. Our roster of podcasts includes shows about business, the arts, sports, politics, movies, self-improvement, technology, fiction, and more. To let the Alberta Podcast Network put together a great campaign for you, get in touch at hello@albertapodcastnetwork.com. Makeshift Stories is released around the beginning and middle of the month. This month's story was written by Alan V. Hare and read by Mitchell II. Opening and closing themes were composed and recorded by Matthew Erdman. Audio production and editing by Makeshift Studios. If you'd like to connect with us, please send an email to makeshiftstories@gmail.com or visit our website at makeshiftstories.com. Links to both are in the show notes. You can help us out by getting your friends to subscribe or follow wherever they listen to audio. Makeshift Stories is released under a Creative Commons non-commercial attribution no derivative license, which means you are free to share our stories. Just remember to credit us and don't alter anything.